Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that washes things clean. This was the cold, relentless Maine rain that comes in sideways off the Atlantic. The kind that finds every crack in every wall, that seeps under doors and gets into your bones, and reminds you, quietly and without mercy, that you are small and the ocean is not. Jack Mercer stood at the end of the dock, his hands deep in the pockets of his old Navy jacket, and stared at the island. It sat roughly 400 yards offshore, a broken knuckle of granite rising from the gray water, topped with a weathered 2-story house that looked like it had been arguing with the wind for 100 years and had mostly lost. A single light burned in the downstairs window, pale, steady, like something still breathing in there. Jack had not cried at his grandfather's funeral. He had not cried in 31 years of service, through 2 wars, through a marriage that quietly dissolved like salt in water, through the long, hollow years of coming home to an apartment where no one asked how he was doing, and the television was the only voice in the room. But standing there on that dock, staring at the only thing his grandfather had left him, he felt something move behind his eyes, something old and pressurized, like a depth charge sitting on the ocean floor for decades, just waiting. He blinked it back, picked up his single duffel bag, and climbed into the small aluminum boat that the harbor master had left tied to the dock for him. The family had made their feelings known 3 days earlier in a lawyer's office that smelled of old wood and bitter coffee. Jack's cousin, Dennis, had laughed first. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. More the kind of laugh that people use when they want to wound you, but still want to look like they were just joking. "The island," Dennis had said, leaning back in his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who had never missed a meal or a mortgage payment in his life. "The island. He left Jack the island. Of course he did." Jack's Aunt Patricia had pressed her lips together and looked out the window, which was her way of agreeing without technically saying anything cruel out loud. The others in the room, cousins and their spouses, people Jack saw once every few years at holidays, had shifted in their seats and studied their phones and said nothing at all. The lawyer, a quiet older man named Harold Fitch, had read the will without expression. The house in Portland went to Patricia. The savings, modest but real, were divided among the grandchildren. The boat went to Dennis. And to Jack Thomas Mercer, retired Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, went the island, the house on it, the contents within, and the dog. "The dog," Dennis had repeated, as if this were the final confirmation of something he had long suspected about the universe. Jack had said nothing. He had sat straight in his chair, the way men sit when they have been trained to endure things quietly, and he had listened to every word, and when it was done, he had shaken Harold Fitch's hand, walked out into the gray November afternoon, and driven 6 hours north to the Maine coast. He told himself it didn't hurt. He was 58 years old. He had survived things that would have broken most men in half. He did not need his family's approval, or their sympathy, or their understanding of what he had given or what he had lost. He told himself all of this very clearly and firmly for most of those 6 hours. It still hurt. The aluminum boat scraped against the island's small stone landing, and Jack climbed out and tied the bowline to an iron ring that had been set into the rock so long ago it had turned the color of the stone itself. He stood for a moment, the wind pressing hard against his chest, and looked up at the house. Then the door opened. The dog appeared in the doorway slowly, the way old soldiers appear in doorways, without urgency but without hesitation either. He was a German shepherd, large even now in his age, with a muzzle gone almost entirely white and eyes the deep amber color of old whiskey. He stood at the top of the stone steps and looked down at Jack with an expression that was not quite welcome and not quite suspicion, but something in between. Something that said, "I am watching you. I am deciding." Jack climbed the steps. He stopped 2 steps below the dog so that they were eye to eye. He had been briefed on Ranger by Harold Fitch, who had told him simply that the dog was 11 years old, that he had been with Edmund Mercer for the last 4 years of his life, and that he was, in Fitch's exact words, a serious animal. "Hey, Ranger," Jack said quietly. Ranger looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and went back into the house. Jack followed him in. The house was cold, but not unloved. Every surface held evidence of a life lived with intention. Fishing maps pinned to the walls with careful notations in his grandfather's cramped handwriting. A shelf of books, mostly history and engineering texts, their spines cracked and pages dog-eared. A cast-iron wood stove in the corner with a small stack of split logs beside it. And dominating the far wall of the main room, a massive granite hearth built from the island's own stone, wide enough to park a car in, old and absolute and permanent. Jack built a fire, fed the dog, ate a can of soup standing at the kitchen counter, and sat down in his grandfather's chair by the hearth. Ranger lay on the braided rug nearby, his chin on his paws, his amber eyes open and watching. "Just you and me then," Jack said to the room. Ranger's ears moved slightly, but he said nothing, which, Jack supposed, was fair enough. The first week passed slowly, and in its slowness, mercifully. Jack repaired 2 broken shutters. He cleared debris from the landing. He found his grandfather's daily logbooks in the back bedroom, 30 years of them, filled with title charts and weather observations, and short, precise sentences about daily life on the island. He read them in the evenings by the fire, Ranger always nearby, and somewhere in the careful, disciplined rhythm of his grandfather's words, Jack began to feel something he had not felt in years, something quiet, something almost like peace. He began to talk to Ranger in the evenings, not conversation exactly, more the kind of talking that a man does when he is kept silent for too long and the words need somewhere to go. He talked about the Navy, about the places he had been and the things he had seen, about his ex-wife, Carol, who had been a kind woman who deserved more presence than Jack had ever been able to give her. About the apartment in Virginia, with its beige walls and its view of a parking garage. Ranger listened to all of it with the grave, unhurried attention of a therapist who charged nothing and judged nothing. Then came the storm. It arrived on a Thursday night in late November with almost no warning, a nor'easter that the mainland weather stations had underestimated badly. The wind came first, shrieking around the corners of the old house, finding every gap and joint and testing them all. Then the rain, driving and horizontal, hitting the windows like handfuls of gravel. The power, which came from a small diesel generator in the outbuilding, flickered twice and went dark. Jack lit the oil lanterns his grandfather had kept in the kitchen cabinet, and the house settled into that ancient half-darkness that reminds human beings how very long people have been sitting beside fires, waiting for storms to pass. He was almost asleep in the chair when Ranger moved. Not the slow, arthritic repositioning of an old dog finding comfort. This was sharp and deliberate. Ranger rose, crossed the room in 4 strides, and went directly to the granite hearth. He lowered his nose to the base of the stone, sniffed twice, and then began to scratch at the granite with his front paw. Not frantically, not in panic, with a steady, insistent, focused purpose that made the sound of his nails on stone cut right through the noise of the storm. Jack watched him. "Ranger, come on, boy, lie down." Ranger ignored him completely.
Jack got up and crouched beside the dog. He pressed his palm against the granite, solid, cold, immovable as the island itself. He looked at Ranger, who looked back at him with those amber eyes that held something beyond animal urgency, something almost like communication. Jack sat back on his heels and looked at the hearth. He had been in special operations long enough to recognize when something was not quite right about a structure. He had cleared enough rooms, examined enough walls, trusted enough instincts in enough dark places to know that the feeling now crawling up the back of his neck was not imagination. He got a flashlight, he got his grandfather's toolbox from the kitchen, and he began to look. It took him 2 hours. The mechanism was extraordinary in its simplicity, which was, he would later understand, entirely characteristic of his grandfather. A specific stone in the lower right corner of the hearth, no different in appearance from the others, that when pressed in a precise, released a counterweight buried inside the granite base. The entire front section of the hearth, 18 inches deep and 4 feet wide, swung inward on hinges so perfectly balanced that a child could have moved it. Beyond it was a passage, stone steps descending into the rock of the island itself. Jack stood at the top of those steps for a long moment, the flashlight cutting a pale beam into the darkness below. Ranger sat beside him, calm now, patient, as though his work were done and the rest belonged to Jack. "All right, old man," Jack whispered. It wasn't clear whether he was speaking to the dog or to his grandfather, perhaps both. He went down. The chamber below was cut directly into the granite bedrock, roughly the size of a large living room, dry and cool and silent in a way that felt engineered rather than natural. And it was. The walls were lined with equipment that Jack recognized immediately: hydrophone arrays, signal processors, frequency analyzers, technology that belonged to a world of patient, invisible vigilance. In the center of the room stood a console, old but meticulously maintained, its indicator lights still glowing a faint and steady green, powered, Jack realized slowly, by a tidal energy system built into the rock foundation of the island itself. His grandfather had built a machine that the ocean itself kept running. On the console was an envelope, Jack's name on the front, in his grandfather's handwriting. His hands were not entirely steady when he opened it. The letter was 3 pages, written in the same careful, disciplined hand as the logbooks. His grandfather, Edmund Mercer, had been an acoustic engineer for the United States Navy from 1961 to 1988. During the Cold War, he had helped design a network of underwater listening stations along the Atlantic seaboard, systems that tracked Soviet submarine movements through the patient analysis of sound. When he retired, he had built this station privately at his own expense on his own island and had continued the watch. Not because anyone asked him to, not because anyone paid him to, because he believed, in the quiet and unshakable way that certain men believe things, that the watch should never end. He had left it to Jack because, the letter said, he was the only one in the family who would understand what it meant to stand a post when no one was watching, the only one who knew. That duty was not something you did for recognition. It was something you did because it was right. The last paragraph was short. Jack read it 3 times before he could move. "I know the world didn't give you much of a welcome home, son. It rarely does for men like us. But I want you to know that I saw everything you gave. Every year, every sacrifice, every quiet night you spent far from home doing things that kept other people safe while they slept. I saw it. I was proud of you every single day. This island is yours. This watch is yours. You were never forgotten. You were chosen." Jack sat down on the stone floor of that hidden chamber, in the cold and the silence, 4 stories beneath a storm-battered house on a granite island in the North Atlantic, and he wept. For the first time in longer than he could remember,
He wept without shame and without restraint, for everything he had carried, and everything he had lost, and everything he had never allowed himself to grieve. He didn't know how long he sat there, long enough for the storm to begin to quiet above him. When he finally climbed back up the stone steps and came through the hidden door into the firelit room, Ranger was waiting exactly where he had left him. The old dog rose slowly, walked to Jack, and pressed his great gray head against Jack's leg. Jack put his hand on Ranger's neck and stood there for a long time, the two of them, the aging soldier and the aging dog, while the last of the storm moved out over the Atlantic and the first pale light of dawn began to touch the water. In the weeks that followed, Jack contacted Harold Fitch, who put him in touch with a quiet office in Washington that Jack recognized by its manner, if not by any official name. There were conversations. There were meetings. The station was evaluated, updated, and quietly integrated into a network that Jack was not at liberty to discuss with anyone. His grandfather's work, it turned out, had been anything but idle. The data accumulated over decades in that stone chamber contained acoustic records of extraordinary value, a 40-year archive of sound from the deep Atlantic that researchers had not known existed. His grandfather had been listening all along, quietly, faithfully, without credit or ceremony, just like Jack.
Dennis called once, in December, having heard through some family channel that Jack was doing something with the island. His tone had shifted considerably from the lawyer's office. He asked careful questions about property value and potential development. Jack listened to him politely and completely, the way men listen when they have already made their decision and simply owe the other person the courtesy of being heard. "It's not for sale, Dennis," he said. "It never was." He hung up the phone and looked out the window at the gray Atlantic, and for the first time in a very long time, he smiled. Christmas came quietly to the island. Jack cut a small spruce from the tree line on the north side and put it in the corner of the main room. He found in a box in the back bedroom a collection of old ornaments, each one wrapped carefully in newspaper, each one carrying some small ghost of memory. He hung them one by one, while Ranger watched from the rug with his patient amber eyes, and the wood stove ticked, and the ocean pressed its cold shoulder against the stone of the island, and the world outside was enormous and dark and indifferent. But inside, there was warmth. There was light. There was a man who had finally come home, not to a place, but to a purpose. And beside him, steady and faithful and unhurrying, was the dog who had refused to let him miss it. Some inheritances are measured in money. Some are measured in land or in objects or in the comfortable accumulating weight of things. But the rarest kind, the kind that only certain men in certain moments are trusted to receive, is measured in purpose, in the knowledge that someone who loved you saw exactly who you were and believed without reservation that you were exactly the right person for the work that needed to be done. Edmund Mercer had stood his watch alone for 40 years on a granite island off the coast of Maine, and he had done it without complaint and without recognition and without ever asking anyone to understand. And when it was time, he had looked across the whole of his family with the clear and patient eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime listening carefully, and he had chosen the one who would understand. Not the richest one, not the loudest one, not the one with the most to gain. The one who knew what it meant to stand in the cold and the dark and the wind and stay. Ranger lived another 14 months after Jack came to the island. He slowed gradually, the way good and dignified things slow, without drama, without complaint. He spent his last winter lying in the patch of thin winter sunlight that came through the south window each afternoon, his great head resting on his paws, his amber eyes still open, still watching, still faithful to the last. Jack buried him on the high point of the island, where the granite rose above the tree line and you could see the full sweep of the Atlantic in every direction. He marked the grave with a flat stone from the beach, and on it, with a chisel and patient hands, he carved 2 words: "Good watch." And every morning after that, before he descended to the chamber and began the day's work, Jack stopped at that grave for a moment, just a moment, to remember the dog who had led him to everything that mattered, who had pressed a gray muzzle against a broken man's leg in the dark and reminded him, without words, that he was not alone, that he had never truly been alone. The Atlantic stretched out beyond the island, vast and cold and ancient, the same water his grandfather had listened to for 40 years, the same water that carried sound for hundreds of miles beneath its surface, the deep conversations of a world that most people never heard. Jack listened, every day, faithfully, without recognition, without complaint, just like the old man before him, just like the dog who started it all. The watch continues. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you love, a grandfather who never said enough, a veteran who gave everything quietly, a dog who stayed faithful to the end, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. Please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Hit the bell so you never miss a story, because every week we bring you another tale of loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet courage that holds this world together. These stories deserve to be heard, and the people who lived them deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And as always, God bless the silent ones who stood their watch so the rest of us could sleep.